I want to talk about two quarterbacks today, and I'm going to start with the one whose story ended before it ever really began. Not slowed down, not detoured, ended. And the way it ended tells you something uncomfortable about this league that I think deserves more than just a quick headline and a scroll past. Brendan Sorsby is not suspended. He's not sitting in some gray zone waiting on an appeal. He's done. The NFL sent him a letter, an official commissioner's office letter, and that letter didn't leave any windows cracked. It shut every door with the kind of deliberate surgical language that tells you this decision wasn't reactive. It was planned. And the more I've sat with the details of that letter, the more I find myself genuinely wrestling with two things simultaneously. The conduct that got him here, which is serious and documented and hard to defend, and the organization doing the shutting out, which profits billions from the same ecosystem they just used to justify closing the gate. I'll get to both, but let me walk you through how this actually unfolded, because the timeline is the part most coverage is missing. Sorsby came into this offseason with exactly one viable path left: no college eligibility, no pending draft slot, just a petition submitted June 16th asking the NFL to grant him special eligibility consideration through a supplemental draft. That was it. That was the whole play. And when the league responded, they didn't just say no, they dismantled the argument before it even got off the ground. The first thing the league established in that letter was jurisdiction. Under the collective bargaining agreement, the commissioner's office holds complete, unchecked discretion over whether a supplemental draft happens at all in a given year. They hadn't run one in years. And here's the detail that I keep coming back to, because it reframes the entire situation immediately. Before Sorsby's petition arrived, there was absolutely no intention to run one this year. Not because of scheduling, not because of logistics, because no other eligible player had submitted a request. None. So what Sorsby wasn't doing was asking to join something that was already happening. He was asking the league to build a structure from scratch, specifically and exclusively for him. And the league made sure he understood that distinction before they said anything else. Then the letter got sharper. They noted the petition arrived 3 business days before the procedural deadline. No supporting documentation, no substantive explanation of extraordinary circumstances. And then came the line that I think actually hit the hardest. Not because it was the most dramatic, but because of what it implied about the sequence of events leading to this moment. Sorsby had submitted this petition only after already dropping his own legal challenge against the NCAA's sanctions. Think about that timeline slowly, because the sequence is genuinely damning. He fights the ruling in court, something shifts. Either he loses ground, runs out of realistic options, or comes to terms with the fact that the legal battle isn't winnable. And only after abandoning that fight does he pivot and ask the NFL to become his second escape route. The league read that clearly. Their message, without quite saying it directly, was this: you dropped your own fight when it got hard, and now you want us to open a different door for you. That's not how this works. But none of that was the most significant part of the letter. The most significant part came when they laid out what the NCAA had actually documented. And I need you to stay with me here, because this is where the story stops being about procedural timelines and starts being about something that genuinely matters. Permanent bar from college athletics. Not a multi-year suspension. Not exclusion with reinstatement conditions at the end. Permanent. And the basis for that ruling wasn't a single incident or a bad decision made once in a vulnerable moment. The findings described a sustained, recurring pattern of improper gambling activity spanning his time at 3 separate programs, 3 schools, multiple seasons, multiple environments where there were opportunities to recognize the pattern and stop. And it didn't stop. When you get into the specific conduct that was reported, it becomes progressively harder to frame any of this charitably. Wagers placed on his own team, bets placed on games involving his own teammates, people whose livelihoods and careers were tied directly to every throw he made. And to keep his name off the transaction records, he allegedly used other people's identities and accounts to route the money through. I want to pause on that last piece for a second, because it's easy to read past it and miss what it actually means. That's not a mistake. That's not an impulse, a bad night, a single moment of catastrophic judgment. What that describes is architecture, a deliberate, constructed system designed to keep money flowing while maintaining personal distance from the paper trail. That's someone who understood exactly what was happening was wrong and made a conscious, ongoing choice to keep doing it anyway, carefully enough to avoid being caught for as long as possible. There are also references in the broader reporting to potential violations of state criminal law sitting underneath all of this, though that piece is still developing. What made the league's response cut even deeper was their observation about the petition itself. Through everything that was documented, through all of it, Sorsby's submission to the commissioner addressed almost none of it directly. No acknowledgement of the conduct, no real accountability, no explanation of what would actually be different if the league opened this door. He didn't confront what happened. He tried to move around it through legal positioning and only redirected toward the NFL when the legal options were gone. The league found that insufficient. More than insufficient. They found it disqualifying. And when they closed the letter, they used the familiar Goodell language about the privilege of competing in this league, acknowledged that real talent exists here, and pointed toward the 2027 draft as the earliest possible next conversation. Adam Schefter's read on this was clear, and I think it was accurate. This wasn't only about Brendan Sorsby as an individual. The league used this moment to send a message that any organization with this much at stake would want on record. Whatever happened in your previous football life, whatever conduct was documented before you came through our doors, you address it before you arrive. You don't get to outrun the record by changing the jurisdiction. And here's where it gets complicated for me, because this is the part I genuinely struggled with, and I don't think doing this story honestly lets me skip over it. The NFL generated enormous revenue last year from gambling partnerships. Betting app advertisements run during live game broadcasts. Odds integrations are built directly into broadcast graphics. The league has embedded sports wagering into the fan experience at nearly every level of consumption. And yet here they stand, drawing what they're calling an absolute ethical line. The moment a player's name connects to gambling, even when the NCAA itself noted there was no finding of an in-game integrity violation tied to his specific wagers. The league wasn't interested in making that distinction. The word and the name appear together, and that's sufficient. They wanted a clean outcome, and they engineered one by declining to hold the draft at all. I heard this tension framed as bluntly as I've ever heard it put. An organization sitting on billions in gambling revenue positions itself as the guardian of integrity the moment a player gets caught in wagering. That is a real contradiction. I don't think we do anyone any favors by smoothing it over just because the headline sounds decisive. But the same voice making that point wasn't letting Sorsby walk either. The conduct, if accurately reported, was serious, deliberate, and sustained across multiple programs and multiple seasons. Both things are true. Sorsby's documented behavior appears to have been genuinely damaging and ongoing. And the league that just shut him out profits substantially from the same ecosystem they cited as the reason he can't enter their building. I'm not going to pretend one of those truths cancels the other, because it doesn't. The discomfort of holding them together is exactly what makes this story complicated instead of clean. Where does he go from here? Some voices have raised the possibility of additional legal action, but the real leverage barely exists. There's no supplemental draft to contest in court. There's no roster spot being withheld that he can point to as unlawful exclusion. The opportunity simply doesn't exist in a form that can be litigated. He waits, he prepares, he demonstrates something different over the next calendar year, or he doesn't. And time, which was already pressing against him, keeps moving regardless of what any of the coverage says. Now let me shift to Cleveland, because something was happening there simultaneously that had a completely different texture but carried its own kind of frustration, and it got buried somewhat under the weight of the Sorsby coverage, even though it deserves real attention. Trade rumors about Shedeur Sanders before a single preseason snap. Before training camp had reached anything close to full competitive intensity, reports were circulating, labeled speculative but spreading with the velocity of confirmed news, connecting Shedeur's name to the Jets, the Dolphins, the Cardinals, the Buccaneers as potential destinations if Cleveland decided to move him for the right return. When this hit the airwaves, the reaction from former players who've actually been inside that world was something to pay attention to. One former Browns defensive back couldn't get through his initial response without the frustration coming through raw in his voice. And the frustration made complete sense. We've watched this quarterback work. We've seen real measurable growth in how he's processing defenses, how he's operating within a system. We haven't seen him take a single preseason snap in live game conditions yet, and already the conversation has jumped to packaging him in a trade before he's proven anything conclusively, before he's failed anything either. The speculation is leapfrogging the entire process that would give anyone actual, meaningful information and landing directly on transaction mode. And then someone in that conversation raised a question that reframed everything for me, because once it was asked, I couldn't unhear it. What if the timing of these rumors isn't accidental? What if the fact that Shedeur has been developing, that there's real, legitimate buzz about him pushing for the starting role, is precisely the reason the trade speculation started surfacing when it did. Because this is how the business actually operates, and if you've watched this league long enough, you know this. A quarterback with rising stock is worth dramatically more on the trade market than one buried on a depth chart with no momentum. If a front office is quietly entertaining the idea of moving on from a player, you don't float that publicly when he's struggling and has no leverage. You float it when everyone's starting to believe in him. You move the asset at peak perceived value. That theory landed differently than almost anything else said in that conversation. The response was somewhere between disbelief and visceral rejection of the premise. The hope expressed was that it was just noise, off-season dead air filling the gaps between now and when real football actually starts and gives everyone something substantive to anchor conversation to. But once the question was in the room, it didn't disappear cleanly. It just sat there. There's also a broader point here that I think deserves more space than it usually gets. Nobody is running this volume of rumor cycles about any other position group on that roster. There's no constant drumbeat of trade speculation about wide receivers or edge rushers with any comparable intensity. The quarterback position gets treated as permanent content fuel in a way nothing else does, because the stakes attached to it are so high that any whisper becomes instantly amplified. A roster decision at quarterback isn't just a personnel move. It's a referendum on the entire direction of a franchise, which means even baseless speculation gets treated with the weight of reported news because the audience can't afford to ignore it even when the sourcing is thin. Then came the specific hypothetical that sharpened everything into focus. Imagine a Cleveland front office executive picking up the phone and pitching Shedeur Sanders to another team for a second-round pick, maybe a first. The immediate answer was flat, not conditional, not dependent on circumstances, just no. And I understand that completely because it reflects something real about how this player should actually be valued. Shedeur Sanders came into this draft as a first-round talent. His evaluation hasn't fundamentally changed. He's not a depth piece you flip for capital because the room got complicated. He's not a reclamation project someone else might prefer in a different system. He's a player you drafted with specific intention, and there's a significant difference between those two things. There's also another layer that gets dropped from these conversations too quickly. The Browns head coach has reportedly wanted Shedeur Sanders on his roster not for months but for years. That kind of sustained investment in landing a specific player at the most important position on the field doesn't evaporate the moment offseason roster management gets messy. When someone has been building toward a specific player for that length of time, you don't ship him out before he's had a real opportunity under game conditions to show what he actually is. The infrastructure of belief surrounding Shedeur Sanders inside that building is not nothing, and the trade speculation feels genuinely disconnected from that reality in ways that most of the reporting isn't fully acknowledging. So, what do both of these stories actually mean when you put them down and look at them together? They're about two completely different quarterbacks in completely different circumstances, but there's something underneath both of them that connects, and it's the thing that stays with me longest after the coverage dies down. In Sorsby's case, the NFL moved with precision and intention. The door wasn't just closed, it was sealed, with language designed to hold up to scrutiny and send a message simultaneously. Whether you read that as principled or strategically self-serving probably depends on how much tolerance you have for organizations that extract billions from an ecosystem, and then use that same ecosystem as moral justification for exclusion. I'll say again what I said before. I don't think one reading cancels the other. Both are accurate. The conduct documented in those NCAA findings appears genuinely serious, sustained, and deliberately concealed, and the league making that conduct the basis for exclusion profits substantially from the broader culture of wagering they're now citing as their ethical foundation. Those truths live together, whether it's comfortable or not. In Cleveland, the story is still moving, still open. Shedeur's development on the field is generating exactly the kind of momentum that makes certain people in certain rooms nervous, the kind that historically gets converted into trade speculation before there's actual football to evaluate. Whether that speculation reflects something real happening inside the organization, or whether it's just the machine filling the dead air of a slow offseason with whatever generates the most engagement, nobody will know until camp opens fully and real football gives the conversation somewhere honest to land. Two quarterbacks, two completely different circumstances. The same thing underneath both stories. In this league, perception moves faster than evidence ever can, and the loudest narratives are almost always the ones with the least amount of actual football behind them yet. That's what I keep thinking about when I try to make sense of all of this. The game hasn't started, and somehow everything is already decided.